Hello, welcome back again to the Register's Comfy Chairs room, where we relax for half an hour and we talk about some of the things that you're talking about on the boards, and we try and make sense of them here. I don't know if we will, but we'll give it a go. So today, I'm promised from my experts a real conversation about cloud. Now, normally, when cloud's mentioned in any of our Regcasts, we all get a little bit tense and say, please, let's not try to mention that too many times. So today, we're trying to be realistic about what cloud really means to you. So, my name's Tim Phillips from the Register, and joining us today from Intel, we have Richard George. Richard, welcome.
Morning, afternoon.
Yeah, and now, Richard, I'm asking you today, because it's like nearly Christmas, I'm asking, what you would want. If you got a present from the industry, what would you want for Christmas?
For a present from the industry, I think I would want some great Christmas results. And a big uptick in notebook sales.
Okay, good company, man. That's what I like. This is what I like. Okay, and also from our old mates, Freeform Dynamics, Dale Vile. Dale, same question to you.
Well, I'd buy one of those notebooks, actually. If it had infinite battery life, it weighed very little, and it gave me a really crisp screen. So, yeah. Come up with the goods, and I'd buy it.
Yeah, dream on, Dale, I'm afraid. Now, what I would want, actually, is I want a really big taser. I drew a picture of it here for you guys. This is me. I'd like a really big taser so I could give an electric shock to anyone that we interview who refuse to answer the questions properly. So, with that in mind, Dale, you kick us off here. What's practical now in the cloud? When we talk about cloud computing, there's a lot of people get very excited about it. What does it actually mean today? How's it changed anyone's behaviour?
One of the biggest problems that we have with cloud computing as analysts, we're going out and we're talking to a lot of people, both in IT departments and vendors and service providers, is actually pinning down what people are talking about, because cloud computing is one of those terms that's used to refer to quite a lot of different things.
You Freeform guys are often quite negative about this, aren't you, the cloud hype thing?
We're negative about the cloud hype. We're not negative about a lot of things that are talked about under the cloud umbrella, because there's some really good things going on. I think what we are negative about is when the word cloud is used as almost kind of a badge that you assign to something which somehow makes it good and new and interesting and revolutionary. And that's not always necessarily the case, because a lot of what goes on under the whole cloud umbrella is very evolutionary. So, there's a lot of good stuff that's been going on for quite a few years now in terms of the way data center architectures have been evolving, ways in which you can introduce a lot more flexibility and efficiency into your data center.
Give me a practical example of something that was, that's normal today, or is aspirational today, possible today, that wasn't around 2 years ago.
I think a lot of people have, for instance, spent a lot of time looking at virtualization, dealing with some of the sprawl of their x86 infrastructures in particular. And this is a legacy of whenever a new application came into the organization, you'd give it its own box. It would end up maybe ticking over at 3%, 5% utilization on average. And you just accumulate all this stuff. So not only is it a waste of hardware, it's, obviously takes a lot of managing, etc. So virtualization has been a great way of clearing up some of that mess, really. But you've still ended up with a relatively fixed infrastructure. So now, maybe rather than having 10 servers running 10 different applications, you've now got one server with those 10 apps on it. Well, what's happening now, and what's possible now, is you're able to now shift things around much more conveniently. And that's what's real today versus maybe 5 years ago. The idea of moving a workload depending on changing demands to a bigger box or a smaller box, or actually spreading the load across several boxes. That wasn't really that possible before. It existed on PowerPoint charts, but it didn't really exist in terms of management tools, etc. Those sorts of things are now possible, and that is a very, very big leap forward in terms of the flexibility and efficiency gains that fall out of that in the data center.
Richard, what do you see that's practical about cloud now that wasn't a couple of years ago?
That's a good question. Things like Salesforce.com have been around for a long time. I think the evolution, I think it is an evolution. Cloud, there's a lot of hype. I think we're on a very, very long roadmap where cloud is part of that evolution. So we're already there with virtualization. We see a lot of that happening today, and that's very important in the data center when you start to think about heat and power consumption. So we have to consider that. And that's a big driver, I think, around cloud. People want to utilize or get the best utilization out of their infrastructure. Some quotes have been down at 8%, 16% utilization of my data center. We have to get that up to 60, 70%. And cloud is a way of taking us to that utilization. So for me, I would like to see us think about what we do with heat and power, how we reduce that in the data center, and then how cloud then evolves as a result of that. So it's an evolution for me.
Can I just pick up on one of the things Richard mentioned there, which is the whole outsourcing hosted service thing, because I think that's another big development that's taken place. There's nothing new about hosted services, but I think a lot of the ways in which technology has developed has allowed service providers to deliver things, A, in a lot more of a flexible manner, but B, much more cost effectively. So in that sense, there's been some good early activity out there. Some good established players like Salesforce.com, for instance, that was mentioned. But I think we're starting to see a little bit more of a maturing of an approach as to how service providers go to market in a way that makes their services a lot more viable than maybe they were a few years ago. A bit of growing up on that side.
I mean, I can see that a lot of people are comfortable with Salesforce and they're comfortable with using a Gmail infrastructure, for example, for their company email. Sort of thing. It's some way short of being a revolution, though, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, when you look at things like Salesforce, Gmail, or whatever, the things they have in common is that there aren't a huge number of touch points with other applications. I mean, most core business applications, if you look at the average data center, integrate with many other, components and applications that exist in the same environment. The things that have taken off in terms of those hosted services have tended to be the more discrete kind of applications that don't need all that integration. And that's important because, obviously, if you're trying to integrate things between your in-house infrastructure and a service provider infrastructure, there are some things to consider there, which, we can probably pick up a little later in terms of applications.
I think the banks as well, you talk about IT hosting, I think it's the banks that may well lead us through this evolution. And part of the IT thought process in the banks is, how do I charge each part of my business for the IT that they use? So, for example, if the futures market's working after 5 o'clock, how can I bill them appropriately? Because they're going to be making a lot of money. So why aren't they paying for that IT that they're using, that I can then reinvest the profits from that back into providing better infrastructure back to the business?
Do you think that that's something that will be specific to those kind of organisations, very, very large users of IT, or do you think there's going to be a trickle down where that behaviour is going to spread?
I think we get a trickle down. So I think you'll see some of the bigger enterprise players leading the march, and that will be in a private arena that they will develop for their own use. And then as that starts to become defined, and we have the right security levels, the right process, the right procedures in place, I think then we will see an outsourcing of that, of different processes, where appropriate, to different organizations, which then builds the private cloud and the public cloud. And that's where we have to have the interoperability.
Because they've got the internal behaviors established that would allow them to pick up on some of these great promises that are being so heavily hyped at the moment.
For me, it'll be about the processes and the procedures to make sure that everybody's legal in what they do. So, for example, the CIO can still go to jail today, right? If he is not absolutely in control of his IT and something goes wrong, he's the man accountable for it. So the process and procedures have to be in place. Due diligence has to be done, and we have to know where our process is, or where that piece of data is in the whole company's workload.
Well, let's stick with that let's stick with this sort of topic, because what does need to be done to make the promise of cloud ready for prime time at the moment? What's urgent?
Yeah, I think, what we're talking about here is we've alluded to the fact that some of the technology is maturing, some of the service provider behaviour is maturing, but actually we do need some developments to take place internally as well to allow organisations to take cloud on board, or various forms of cloud on board in the right kind of way. I mean, one of the things, for instance, is what cloud computing tends to do, whether it's the notion of separating hardware from software and having workloads moving around willy-nilly from server to, well, not willy-nilly, but moving around freely from server to server as demands fluctuate.
I like your jargon.
It kind of screws up the old accounting model of, someone wants a system in a particular department, so you buy a piece of software, you buy a piece of hardware to go with that, and a database license, and some storage, etc. And that's it. It's a system, and it gets allocated to a cost center, and everyone's happy. The accountants can now just depreciate that over time and do all the kind of stuff that we've been doing for years. Well, actually, as soon as now that application may be running on those 3 servers at this moment in time, but this afternoon it might be running on 12 other servers. I mean, you've now broken the dependency between your assets, so no longer can you account for IT in the same kind of way. And that's quite interesting because there's a big cultural thing here, which is around the notion of really having to invest in IT infrastructure and not always necessarily being able to tie that investment to a given project or a department or any other cost center entity that might be in your organisation.
So security is the key point in that, I think, whether that be at the application level, the operating system level, and in that you think about all the different virtualized operating systems that you have, and then even further down the stack at the hardware level. So I think we've got 3 levels of security that people are going to have to think about in their infrastructures as to how to take care of it and how to work it. Because without that compliance, then we can't go back and all the procedures, compliance just breaks down. So I think 3 levels: application, operating system, and we think about the virtual machine environments there, and then at the hardware level.
For the people who are the cloud vendors, they're going to have to hang on and wait for their customers to get that sorted out, though, aren't they?
I think, there's a lot of cultural change and shift has to happen, and the way we think about it will have to change quite dramatically.
But it's not a good time for this at the moment. A lot of organisations are very risk averse at the moment. They're under a lot of pressure, and they have a lot to do, maybe with fewer IT staff than they had last year. A major problem like this is going to get stuck on the drawing board.
No, I don't think so. I think people have to continue to evolve is the first thing, and we have to find ways of doing things differently. Not necessarily what we did yesterday. We talk about the one box, one application solution. I think that we've pretty much broken through that. The fact now that we're changing a lot in the data center around power consumption, driving different behaviours. You can't get another watt of power into Canary Wharf till after the Olympic Games. So we have to do things differently, and I think that's the real driver of change, rather than we have to be a bit more frugal with our budgets. I think we have to be smarter with our budgets.
I think if you think a bit more selectively, so you can think of cloud as this big transformational change, and it changes everything, as you hear some of the evangelists talk. But what it really does is it gives you choices as to how to deal with specific requests from the business. So I was talking to someone the other day about they were saying that it took them 6 weeks from getting a request from the business to implement a new application to actually being able to deploy it, because you've got the process of getting the purchase order requisition in place for the hardware that's needed. Then you've got the actual procurement process itself, the delivery, the installation, the provisioning, etc. And, end to end, on average, it was 6 weeks to get a new server in with an application running on it. And interestingly, they put a lot of people call it a private cloud in place, so a very flexible infrastructure, so they could grab a bit of resource when they needed to do something new. Now they're down to about 3 or 4 hours to provision a new application. Now that's not a total transformation of everything they do, but what it does mean is that they've been able to identify certain hotspots within business where that kind of flexibility is really important, and put a discrete subset of their or set a discrete subset of their infrastructure up to behave in that way, so that they can rapidly respond. So it doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing, I think, Tim. That's the main thing.
I see what you mean. Well, let's take that a little bit further and look at the continuity between the private cloud and the public cloud, the thing that everyone's got so excited about. At that join between private and public, again, there's going to have to be quite a lot of retooling of how we do things.
Yeah. Well, there's people talk about 3 layers in terms of cloud. Infrastructure as a service, which is all about storage and compute cycles and just buying resources basically. People talk about platform as a service. We'll put that one to one side because that's a bit of a special case. But then you've got software as a service, which is mostly about applications. If you take the first one, a lot of the requirement, essentially what you're talking about there is grabbing some server cycles from someone else's data center and putting one of your workloads on it. Well, you still need to manage that workload. You still need visibility of what that workload's doing and be able to troubleshoot it, move it around, bring it back in-house. So that's the real dependency there is on your management tool infrastructure. So are your systems management capabilities that are in place today able to handle those kind of scenarios? So that's one thing. When you move up into more of the software as a service layer, you get more into some of the things that you were talking about in terms of security management and policy management in general. But also things like end user support start to become a question, particularly when you've got integration points between a SaaS provider and an in-house application, for instance. If something goes wrong, if those things are not working properly together, who's responsible for what in terms of resolving issues. So, there are quite a few practical things that need to be considered as you...
And is this going to be done at a technical level or a contractual level?
Needs to be a mixture of both. So if you think about working across boundaries, there's a technical question which is around standards, interoperability and manageability, well, arguably security as well, which is an aspect of that. But then there's the contractual question around service levels, who's responsible for what's the scope of that service, which is something people often forget. I mean, we've been talking mostly, I think, implicitly about large organisations, but when you come down to smaller organisations, and particularly when you're talking about software as a service, buying application services, then the question is what's included in that contract. So, I mean, just take our own example. We outsource all of our email and collaboration infrastructure to a service provider, and when we were shopping for those services, we found that you could get some really good deals with service providers who would give you a mailbox, an Exchange mailbox, for instance, very, very cheaply, but really on the understanding that you would field all of the support side of things from the end users. We elected to go with someone just because of the kind of business that we are, that would allow non-technical users to call the help desk of the service provider directly. It cost us more money because it's a broader scope of service, but for us that suited really well. Now, if you're really well geared up with your own internal help desk, you may elect to go for the cheaper option. The point being, though, you need to understand what's included and who's responsible for what, and if you don't, you're going to maybe get some surprises down the line, and that can run into issues with satisfaction.
Well, I think it does matter about which applications you might think about outsourcing. We're all pretty comfortable with mail. We all have an online mail account, and that's not new to people. I think it's when it comes to maybe your billing system or your ordering system, i.e. the core to your business is that piece of data. And are you happy to outsource that? In some smaller companies, they may well be happy to outsource that because they don't have the infrastructure or the people around them to do it. As you get further up the stack, that becomes the crown jewels. And I think you make some choices at that point as to whether that really is the crown jewels and the core of your business, and you hold on to control and management of that.
There have also been some complaints about the slow progress towards interoperability and the fear of being locked in to one person, to one cloud provider. I mean, you don't really care who wins, but it's better for you if they play together nicely, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and it's important. We see it as we want an open infrastructure, and that's critical with data and information, technology moving seamlessly between private and public clouds. I think that's kind of number one, very important. We want it federated. Right, so we want it to be able to seamlessly talk and be managed between the two. If you can't do that, you really haven't got a lot going for you, and I think that will break it. If it cannot be managed and data and resource move between the two environments, then really cloud kind of falls out the sky, really.
I see what you did there. That's quite good. Do you think that's very practical? I mean, you've been through quite a few generations of IT where this debate comes up time and time again. Are we getting better at solving that and getting people to work together at the early stages?
Do you know, I think what's interesting, and you mentioned that we're a little bit challenging, let's say, about some of the things that are discussed in the industry around cloud. And we find a huge difference between conversations we have with end user organisations, guys out there in mainstream IT departments who aren't easily duped. They're not easily taken in by some of the rhetoric that we hear. And people who are either trying to sell stuff or are commenting on stuff. And I think the important thing is that out there in sort of buyer user land, people have still got their heads screwed on, and they do apply an element of common sense. And for instance, if you take a specific example, you talked about lock-in and that kind of stuff. If you go with an organisation, a service provider, who's providing you with a SaaS service, and as the foundation for that, they're using their own homegrown application, if for whatever reason you are unhappy with that service down the line, or your circumstances change and it's no longer suitable, you got a problem, because you can't go to another service provider and just transport your data across, because no one else runs that application but them. If, though, the service provider has built that application on something which is industry standard, so it might be an Oracle CRM system or a Microsoft CRM system, not only can you provide it, you can find another service provider if you need to, you could also have the option of bringing it back in-house. So, I mean, I've picked two extremes there. There comes a point when you might be comfortable with the proprietary approach because the service provider has got beyond a certain scale, like Salesforce.com, totally proprietary, but actually they're not going to go out of business in a hurry. I hope no one's going to
you definitely hope not. Yeah,
but these are the practical ways of looking at it.
Yeah,
it's the manageability though. I think when we look at the Open Data Center Alliance, part of the concern.
This is the new. I was going to get to this actually. This is this new thing, that user power, really.
Yes.
It? So tell us who's in it.
So the alliance consists of companies that spend in excess of about 50 billion annually worldwide, and I guess it's CIO power coming back to the industry to say, this is what we want. Listen to us. These are the sorts of things we need from you in order for our clouds to develop.
And you are the technical architects behind this whole thing.
Yeah, so we're one of the advisors to them at a technical level.
Data center union, isn't it?
So a technical advisor to some of the CIOs on this Open Data Center Alliance, and for me it's to try to take them forward. So we've got 20 or so predefined cloud-ready infrastructures that people can take. It's all up on the internet, so people can look at that as a template or a blueprint, take that inside their own organisations, and then start to develop from that point. But for me, come back down to the basic infrastructure level, we have to think about the management of the key technologies there. So, for example, if you're moving an application from a private cloud to a public cloud, is it as simple as a drag and drop? Can I see that piece of hardware or that compute engine over there and drag and drop it? I think that's the sort of things we've got to start to think about as we move forward.
I'd imagine there's quite a few chief risk officers who are thinking, I hope it isn't as simple as a drag and drop, aren't they?
Well, I think it will depend on the data and the data sources and where that sits in the company's infrastructure. Is it a critical app? Is it something that is core to my business? Do I really want to drag that outside the firewall? Probably not.
Dale, I saw you were blogging about this recently as well. Again, we end up talking about how this is going to make the IT manager redundant because everything's going to go on out there where there's people to do it for us. Think this is true?
No, not at all. It's the best way to think of cloud computing, in my view, in both its forms, which is more flexible internal IT and on-demand services in various shapes, is something which just gives you a lot more choices. So when a new requirement comes up from the business, you can now legitimately ask yourself, do I fulfill that through a traditional kind of rigid system stack approach? Do I actually use those hosted services more fixed? You pay an amount per month on a 12-month contract or 2-year contract or 5-year contract to a service provider. We've been doing that for 30 years. Or do I stick it on some kind of internal dynamic pool of resource, a private cloud, or do I outsource it, or do I have part of it running on an on-demand elastic cloud infrastructure, something like Amazon, or a lot of the traditional hosted service providers have started to introduce much more flexible services now, whereas previously they were quite fixed. The point is, it's about choice, and it's not about wholesale move, because one of the things that cloud does represent is flexibility, and physical flexibility is one thing, but actually in a commercial sense you usually end up paying for flexibility. So the last thing you want is to put fairly fixed demand applications onto a highly flexible outsourced service, because you'll end up paying for flexibility that you never use.
So to Richard, that means you're going to end up with them sorting out some quite difficult resource allocation and compliance problems, isn't it? I mean, that's where our IT managers are heading in their skills.
I think it's already happening, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that we've seen recently is we've had a mantra of consolidate 9 servers to 1 and see a payback in 5 months, right? I think that now is playing out. So we see a change in the mix of product that we're shipping, and that's generally driving to a better quality processor with a big memory footprint, and people are taking that, consolidating lots of applications down onto it, virtualizing them, and that's the first change, right? That's the first step that we see in the evolution to cloud. So it's beginning to happen, and it's happening at quite a pace. I would suggest in the last 12 months, the mix of product has changed. So people are buying better product, big memory footprint, and then executing against that.
One thing I would say, though, just to pick up on that, some of the register research that we've done recently suggests that it's not an automatic next step to move beyond that consolidation that you've just mentioned to a fully virtualized, dynamic, fully managed virtualized environment that has all that flexibility we were just talking about, because consolidation is very much a quick win. It's a no-brainer, right? You're clearing up a bunch of redundant stuff, and you're going to save money. It pays back very, very quickly. But actually, to take it to the next level does involve some of the changes in behaviour, discipline, accounting structures, and other things. So it's not that people aren't doing it, but what we're finding is that people are doing it in a very measured kind of way. They're not rushing wholesale into it, because if you do, it's actually quite risky, because there are a whole bunch of things that you need to have in place to do it safely.
So if you're an IT manager today, what's the first set of courses you're signing up for when you're looking at dealing with this?
I think it's not necessarily about courses. A lot of what it comes down to is understanding your own environment and your own requirements. And that might sound like a really obvious thing to say, but it's amazing actually when we run surveys through the register, people are generally quite honest about the degree to which, for instance, their asset management capabilities are quite severely lacking, which by definition means they don't really know what's in their infrastructure and how everything relates to each other. Well, if you're starting from that kind of point, it's difficult to predict what's going to happen and what you need to think about in terms of dependencies when you start to introduce third parties into the mix, or you start to, even internally, you start to introduce a different way of platforming things.
So there's the application stack for me, I think, is the, you want to sign up to a course. It would be, how do I know what my application stacks look like? What versions are they all on? I mean, that's always an interesting discussion. And then, what are the interdependencies between those different applications? So how can I break them down so that some of them can be outsourced, some of them are my crown jewels and will never leave the premises, and some, which I think you already mentioned, were like the internet-facing apps, where they're a lower risk project to start to consolidate and change. So I think if you start to break your data center up, start with the applications is the critical thing. Find those that can and will change. Look at the stacks, look for the interdependencies, and remember all of that has to be in the bounds of the process of the company to make sure that you're compliant. So compliance becomes then quite a big issue. But it will already be there in most companies. There will be a compliance program, and therefore, how does compliance and those applications then, how do they interact? And then look for the way you can break that down.
Yeah, I mean, I won't echo the compliance thing. I'll just I agree with there has to be emphasis on that. There's another way of thinking about it. A lot of what we've been talking about is bottom up, looking from the IT infrastructure out. A lot of organisations that we've spoken to, probably about 1 in 5 large companies, have genuinely made the move to think more in terms of service delivery. So what I mean by that is they don't talk to their business stakeholders about applications, they talk to them about services. So they talk about the email service, not the email server or the email system. The important thing about that is, coming back to what I was saying about cloud equals choice, once you've defined what the service is about, put some service level definitions around it.
You're then free to do it.
You can do what you want behind the scenes. And that's a huge leap forward in terms of taking advantage of that flexibility.
Okay, thank you very much, guys. We are out of time now. That's ripped along, actually. That was a very quick half an hour. So, well, I hope it did for you. Anyway, actually, it's quite good for us. Let us know what you think of this, because if you send us comments, then my clipboard just isn't for show, actually. It really does have your comments on it. So I refer to those, and we use them to work out what we're talking about. So, let us know what you thought of what we were talking about here, if you agree or disagree, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you very much, guys. My name's been Tim Phillips from Register. Goodbye.